Good evening. My name is Ted Landsmark. I am the director of the Kitty and Michael Dukakis Center for Urban and Regional Policy at Northeastern University. And you have tuned into the open classroom. This is the last of our sessions for this semester, during which we focused on post-pandemic recovery strategies and on ways different parts of our economy and our city and our region will be moving forward in 2021 and beyond. We have covered issues of housing and health and economic development, small business development. Tonight we have the great pleasure and opportunity to hear about culture and what is happening and what is projected to be happening at our greatest cultural institution in Boston, the Museum of Fine Arts. Before we begin, I will just note that we invite your questions, and we will get to as many of your questions as we can tonight. You should post those within our question and answer box. And you can also respond to us and to what things may have been said in our chat box. Tonight's session, as is the case with all of our sessions, is being broadcast and is being archived. So you'll have an opportunity to tell your friends and colleagues about what you heard in tonight's presentation. I should note that we will be back in the spring, and we will be focusing on matters of placemaking, economic development, social justice, and the ways in which a sense of place can drive all kinds of approaches to addressing social justice and economic development. And I can tell you that in the fall of 2021, we will be dealing with racial justice, hate crimes, anti-Semitism, Black Lives Matter, and ways in which advocates are coming together to address issues of racial and social justice. Tonight, I'm thrilled to be able to introduce the Museum of Fine Arts director, Matthew Teitelbaum, whom I've known and worked with for a long time. He was a curator at the Institute of Contemporary Art when I was on the board there. And we've developed over the years a working relationship that draws upon what has become his reputation as a highly progressive museum director, both in Canada and in the United States. And he has brought with him two of his working colleagues, and we will talk about the museum, about diversity, and about the role of culture in the city of Boston. So with that introduction, I turn the evening over to Matthew Teitelbaum, director of the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. Matthew, you're on.
Thanks, Ted, very much. I'm joined tonight by Makeeba McCreary, the Chief of Learning and Community Engagement at the Museum of Fine Arts, and Rosa Rodriguez-Williams, the Senior Director of Belonging and Inclusion. The three of us are going to have a little bit of a conversation, and we'll be very pleased to take your questions. I might just share with everybody, and Ted, you may or may not remember this. I was also going to say we've known each other for a long time. And when I walked into the room after my appointment and I met the board for the first time, in other words, I had met some of the board members, but not the whole board. I walked into this room not knowing what was beyond the door, and the first person I saw was you, Ted. And it gave me such a feeling of, I'm home, I'm somewhere where I can do my work. And I just have felt that about you for so long, Ted. You help us all do our work. So great respect for the work that you do, really. really.
Well, thank you very much. And that is certainly a subtext of our conversation tonight. That is to say, how can a large cultural institution be welcoming within the city of Boston? So why don't you carry on?
Well, I think one way is we could have Ted Landsmark at the front door and he could just say hello to everyone when they come in. That would be a good place to start. So let me say a few things about this moment of museums. And then I have a few questions for my colleagues. And then again, as I say, happy to take questions from our listeners. It seems a cliche, and I'll just say it, we live in challenging times. And for us at the museum, this is both external and internal. Things are shifting, they're uncertain, they seem to be changing constantly. And it's a change that's not just about questioning, it's a change that's about asserting. Questions turn into assumptions about history, hierarchy, tradition, values. And I have to say that I find in this moment that ideas are less probed in public space than assumed. These are challenging and aggressive times. That leads me to say that we need museums more than ever. We need the museum to bring people together for conversation. Because we do confront a world in which there is deep skepticism. There's a broadly felt, and I would say deeply experienced, sense that institutions have failed us. There is a generalized feeling to some that institutions are illegitimate, that they don't create and they don't tell truth, and that their stories are incomplete. I would also say that for us in museums, the shift in acknowledgement, inclusion, reciprocity is tied also to an urge for structural change. So whatever feelings there are about we have to tell our stories differently, there's also a desire for institutions to be structured differently. And for me, that leads to one of the key questions of leadership in museums today. How do we celebrate the past and at the same time anticipate the future? How do we acknowledge why we are who we are and yet step into the future? And for me, this is related to how do we change the makers of narrative? How do we change the makers of the stories we tell? How do we narrate difference differently? Now, I'm going to say self-evidently that we are asking ourselves these questions in the midst of a worldwide health crisis that's created inequity, greater degrees of prejudice, and financial hardship. We are doing our work in that external condition. And for not-for-profits, dependent as the MFA is on earned revenue, we are doing our work with budget challenges that are unprecedented in my time as a museum director. It's not quite certain how it's going to get resolved. Are we doing things? Are we putting our arms around the challenges? Are we working in a way that allows us to be confident that together we can get something done? Absolutely. But the end game is still uncertain. I believe there will be lasting change out of this moment, and much of it is very positive. Much of it is very positive. We have found some new revenues from new partnerships. We found new partnerships, meaning to say we don't feel as alone on certain issues as we did before. We have learned as a staff and between the MFA and other institutions and other organizations, we've learned how to convene differently, how to share differently, maybe how to be a bit vulnerable with each other. This is online, but not only online. There are other ways in which we've convened that have been deeply meaningful. And I think that we have also, as a result, deepened a sense of professional community. I have shared more with my fellow museum directors about my doubt, my strategic thinking, the risks I'm prepared to take. I've shared a lot more of that than I ever have before, and it's come back to me. So I need to say there's some really good things that are happening in the way that we are gathering to problem solve together. For us at the museum, a lot of this, so much of it for me, is grounded in our strategic plan that we realized in 2017, a strategic plan we called MFA 2020. It was a 3-year plan with a 10-year horizon. So we're in the middle of it. What we're doing, so much of what we're doing is building on the foundation of that plan. Core to the plan, we had to be more outward facing, and we had to look to others to partner to problem solve. That was the core of our strategic plan. And I think that for many of us working at the museum, we are thinking that way. And for Makeeba and Rosa, 2 of my colleagues who've joined us relatively recently, we're certainly hiring and asking people to come work with us in that spirit. More outward facing, more in partnership, greater generosity. At the core of the strategic plan, 3 words, maybe 4. Invitation, welcome, engagement. How do you invite in a way that people feel that they are being asked to come? How do you welcome them so that you can say, we are glad you're here? And how do you engage them with ideas that matter to them that you can learn from in a reciprocal relationship? This is all in an effort to recast for the MFA the sense of belonging for all who visit. That everybody who visits, by the way, everyone who works there too, should feel that they belong. And the phrase we use often, and by the way, we're using it more than ever, a museum for Boston and a museum of Boston. And it's something we talk about and act on, because we don't think you can be externally what you're not internally. So we talk about this a lot. So I've already got to one of my punchlines, which is that Makeeba and Rosa have joined the museum while I've been director, and they are a big part of the change that I'm talking about. Again, a museum for Boston, but not just for Boston, of Boston. And so let me start some of my questions. And to Makeeba and Rosa, I get to ask my questions before you jump in. Okay, I need to get a few in before you know. But let me start. So Makeeba, you had never worked in a museum before you joined the MFA. You applied, we hired you. What intrigued you? What intrigued you? And address a little bit about what difference you wanted to make.
I came from working in government, which was a place I had never imagined I would end up either. And I realized after 4 years in public service that I actually felt like I could contribute to creating a different experience for school-age children in the Boston public schools. Like, I had enough moments where I saw change. I saw the evidence of even the smallest shift in a policy or a practice or just a decision. And when I left, I knew that I absolutely had to continue to keep that as a part of the DNA of wherever I was gonna end up. I think we had a conversation where I said, like, I'm not applying to any other museums. So it's not really about the museum. It's about making sure that this cultural institution really belonged to all of those kids, so that as they were evolving through their career, they knew that they had a resource where they could cross Huntington Avenue, walk up those grand stairs and into the building, and that we belonged to them. And that was a goal that felt near impossible. And I was excited about that. I was excited about, well, if it's only near impossible, that means that there's room for us to sort of wedge in there and help turn the tanker the way I feel sometimes as we're a tanker. But and you, I will be, you know, for me, leadership is incredibly important. What I'm going to get out of an experience working with someone, I must know that they are willing to teach me. I'm willing, I have to know that they are interested in learning, and that they have the courage to do what they say. And I felt that from you. And so that was the other reason I came to the museum.
And was there something, I'm gonna get to Rosa in a moment, but Makeeba, was there something in your childhood, your learning, your education, like what makes you want to make that kind of change?
I grew up in Boston. I grew up in the South End of Boston. And as I grew into my adulthood, I lost a lot of friends. I lost friends to AIDS. I lost friends to the prison system. I lost friends to just absolutely being unemployed and not being able to operate and function with dignity in the city. And I had a lot of interventions. I mean, I had, you know, 2 parents at home. I had parents who believed very much in education. But other than that, I mean, these were my friends. They were smart. You know, they were going somewhere, and it always made me wonder what that one lever might be. And if I had to choose one, I would say exposure. And I had exposure for sure. I mean, we were on food stamps at times, but I absolutely had seen by the time I was in my 20s, other countries, other parts of the city. I had met people that were very, very different than me, spoke other languages. And I might not speak those languages and I might not have understood what I was seeing, but at least just seeing it means it's real, means it's there, and means that you then can think about how you might want to have access to it if you so choose. And those friends of mine, they did not get exposed.
Thank you for that. Thank you. So Rosa, sort of the same question. You came across the street to come work with us. Say something about why, when you heard about this possibility, it sort of got you, intrigued you. And then I'll ask you to say something about describe your job a little bit. So what attracted you and what in the job attracted you?
Well, I'm gonna shout out Northeastern and the LSCC. But no, seriously, I think, you know, I can ditto a lot of what Makeeba said. I think for me, you know, when the position came up and I applied, you know, it was a time of transition. And I took a look at it, and, you know, and I've shared this story many times, right? I've shared the story about, you know, my experience, and, you know, my experience of an inner city, low income immigrant, you know, moved here when I was 8 years old with my parents to Lawrence, Massachusetts. And, you know, museums were never part of my story. You know, I never took ownership, as Makeeba said, you know, taking ownership, right? Or think of it as a place for me, right? And so, I don't know, it was too wide or too elite. And so people like me didn't go there. And so why now? Well, that, you know, I think that's really directed to that story, why I chose to apply. It's, you know, I think cultural institutions like the MFA are places that everyone and that belong to everyone, right? And that no one should think, as I did, And yet there's a lot of people that do. And so for me, I would like to facilitate those solutions that change that. But not solutions that say, let me include you and make you fit into the culture that exists, but facilitating solutions that shift culture. And people truly feel like they belong, that they can bring their whole self. Like, right, for me would be bring my whole broke immigrant self and fully engage with the space and take ownership and know that this is a place that was also that is also mine.
So how would you talk about your work in terms of dealing with the public versus dealing with staff? Because your title is Senior Director, Belonging and Inclusion. And how does that get expressed in the work you do with the public? And how does it get expressed with the work you do for staff and colleagues in the museum and volunteers in the museum?
Yeah, I think I've been here for 3 months, and I think I could really use an example, especially working with the educators so far, and helping them develop curriculums and presenting their work to like Boston Public Schools in a responsible manner. And so, helping to ask the questions of, what is it that your goal is? What are you presenting to? Who is this for? I'm really helping them think in terms of equity. I just had a conversation with one of our staff members as she was thinking about her program, we're talking about creating spaces that students can really engage with the museum and its collection in deep ways. But also now we have to think about, what are those spaces in terms of technology and broadband and family, and what does that look like as you sort of bring these programs and resources to somebody's living room through Zoom, right? That's a different sort of perspective. And so, for me, it's, making sure that people are doing their part to really create and do their work through an inclusive lens of thinking about who they are serving, who their programs serve. We're staff, we're working with affinity groups. We're 3 months into affinity groups. Staff really are looking to create community for each other, to connect in ways that share their experience within the space, but also support each other in the space, whether it's through thinking about their careers, thinking about professional development, networking opportunities, but also just creating space where they can just, share resources with one another that is fun, that they're just creating sort of this supportive environment where they can engage with each other so that they can then bring their whole self to.
Can you say something about, just share with us, what is an affinity group and how are they structured?
Right, so affinity groups at the MFA are...
By the way, Rosa, I know what they are. I just want, don't worry, this isn't a test.
No, I know.
I want you just to share.
Yeah, so, affinity groups at the MFA are, we started, they started before me. I can't take credit for that. It was work that was being done before, where through the consulting firm that the MFA is working with, they developed these 3 groups, or decided to develop these 3 groups. And so affinity groups are the BIPOC group, the children, the parents and children's group, and the LGBTQIA group. And so these groups are formed to create space and hold space for people to engage with one another in their experience here at the museum, and support one another as they work in a, specifically for BIPOC group, as they work within a predominantly white institution. And so it's just really creating space and holding space for people to engage with one another in deeper ways that share life experiences.
And is there meant to be policy outcomes, or is it really just, is it primarily meant to be a place to connect?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that is something that they definitely would like to see happen. I think they do have, all of these groups have things that they would like to think, leadership to think about, policies that they would like to help create, or thinking that they would like to share. So.
Great. So Makeeba, I want to ask you about art. Can you talk about the Renaissance and what happened between 1467 and, okay.
Yeah,
What
sure.
I want to ask you about
Make
is,
that up.
what I want to ask you about is, I want you to tell us a little bit about why you initiated this brilliant idea of the mural at Madison Park with pro-Black. Like why you did that, and then Rob Stoll as a fellow artist in residence. Like what was your instinct to do that? And secondly, how are you thinking about art differently now that you've been at the museum just under 2 years? So start by telling us about that project, and then link that to your thinking about art and what art can do.
I don't know if you remember in my last interview, I had a PowerPoint presentation, or maybe it was my second to last. And I think the task was that you gave me, the 13 people there, was tell us how you would change the MFA, how your work will change the MFA, and what does success look like, yeah? And on the last slide, I used an image of Rob Gibbs, pro-Black, who I've known for quite some time. And I remember saying to all of you, what success looks like is when Rob Gibbs is a part of our community. Rob Gibbs, who grew up less than 4 blocks away from this museum, and yet has never thought of himself as being a part of the community in any way. And he's an incredible artist, yeah. So you would like him to. And so fast forward, we had an opportunity to think about a project that was outside of our walls, but that also made sure that we were in relationship with the surrounding neighborhoods. And we ended up walking into this pandemic, which was crazy, because we thought everything was going to stop. And ironically, the one project that was able to move forward was the mural, because it was outside and it was on city property. And we just sort of forged ahead, and we raised our hands the second that the city reopened to be first. It was powerful, but we didn't know how powerful it was going to be until we were in it. As Rob was painting every day, people from the neighborhood would walk by, and they would stop and they would stare up, and they would just sort of meditate in that moment. Little girls, so many little girls, would come with a parent, and their parent, you could see the same conversation over and over again. The parent would point up, talk to their child, and the child would stand and stare and smile. And you knew that the conversation was, that's you. You are beautiful. You are powerful. You can own the entire 37-foot wall wherever you choose to. And so over 2 months, and it was only supposed to be a 2-week project, but over 2 months, you see this on a daily basis. You see marches go by on Columbus Ave after George Floyd's murder. And you see the people looking up at this incredible piece of work, piece of art. And that's just it. Before that moment in time, I don't think that our community here at the museum necessarily would immediately reference a piece of art on a building that's not here at 465 Huntington Avenue, that's outside. I don't know that we would have referenced that as something that was a part of our collection in any way, shape, or form. Fast forward, there's a conversation about being able to acquire Rob Gibbs' original sketches of this piece, and that is tremendous. I mean, that is real inclusion. You know, they say, you know, just being asked to the dance isn't really enough. You got to be asked to get out on the dance floor. And that's the way I sort of see that moment, is that we have said, we not only want you to come in to the museum and be a part of our community, but we actually also want to be a part of your community. So that was the first question. And Rob,
how has this made you think differently about art? I
don't think differently about art so much, Matthew, but I definitely think more differently about museums. And I don't know that it's a change of perspective, but I think it's a broadening of my perspective. When I first started working here, this was a really foreign territory. I understood what I read. I knew that, you know, we were keepers, we were stewards, we were responsible for the stories that were able to be told through all of the different objects in our collection. And that was, there's a lot of power in that. So that was exciting to me, but what I didn't fully appreciate was how transferable all of those stories were across different cultures, different time frames, and how you could actually have two different objects from two different parts of the world created at two different times be in relationship with one another. And I go back to the notion of exposure, right? Like when I visualize a young person like Armani, who was part of our first curatorial study hall, walking through the galleries and telling me, guess what? I got lost yesterday. It was fantastic. You know, that is the moment that you say, I don't even know what his relationship was with the object he got lost in front of. Doesn't matter. He got a chance to create that on his own. And he wasn't afraid to do it.
Thank you.
Need more of that.
Thanks. And Rosa, why do you think, I mean, you've been now 3 months, so you've sort of seen the MFA alive, but not really alive, but you've been there and you've seen people walk around and you've been in various galleries as people engage with the art we have. Why do you think art is important to so many people?
I think, you know, I was reading something that that just popped into my head when you asked that question. It was actually, I know Northeastern is doing a racial literacy talk, or and so I was reading about that talk, and what one of the speakers said, I don't remember her name, she said is that cultural institutions are important to identity formation. And I don't remember who that was, but I think that's right. I think that's why art is important to communities, because it reflects you, it reflects your story, it reflects communities, their stories, their struggles, their histories. And I think, you know, not knowing a lot about art, but knowing enough about identity formation and how people connect with each other through stories. What I've come to sort of enjoy, right, because museums were part of my life, is that, you know, I attach to narratives and I attach to stories, and so that's what's making me sort of fall in love with the space and this place is that. And so I think that's why it is important to communities, and I think it's even more so important to you know, folks of color, folks whose have historically been excluded, or their artwork has been racialized in some way that is not enough or good enough or as good, to start to tell their stories in a way that is connecting with communities and people in a way that builds trust, again, between, you know, cultural institutions and folks who think like me or thought like me.
Fabulous. I'm gonna build on your answer and ask Makeeba a question about writing the future, Jean-Michel Basquiat and the hip hop generation. So you came into an institution that was working on that project. You helped us understand how to broaden its meaning. You brought in conversations, you brought on different points of view. What did you learn from working with your colleagues at the MFA on that exhibition that's made you think about storytelling and creation of space in the museum that you're going to apply to future projects? What happened in working on that project that has opened up something for you?
Well, I would start by saying that the trigger for that collaboration was really when you started to talk about the museum being not just for Boston, but of Boston. And for me, that opened up a whole conversation about the notion of like a hip hop generation. And this exhibition was, really embedded in a space of New York, New York City, but I grew up in Boston here, where we also feel like we had a hip hop, moment. And in working with Liz and Greg, I think the answer to your question is we talk a lot about challenging expertise, about also challenging, interrogating who is the expert, and what is that information? Why is it so special? How do we know it's the only way that you can think about telling this story? And we really got into it together. Like the three of us really dug into it. And when we started to invite other experts in to help us really understand how to make the exhibition an exhibition of Boston and for Boston, it's sort of like a synapse. I think of it like a synapse. Like once one thing's fired off, then the next thing fires off, and you're able to just continue to make discoveries. And so knowing that you may not start with exactly the right question or exactly the only question, we started with, how do we make sure that this exhibition is going to be relevant to the 20-somethings of today? They weren't around in the 70s. Many of them don't even know who Basquiat, Jean-Michel Basquiat was, but they will connect to this exhibition, but we cannot take it for granted that it's just because it's got color and got good music and about a Haitian Puerto Rican artist. We can't take that for granted. So the two things I would say is really reinforced us not taking anything for granted. And number two, knowing how much people really do want to be in this museum and want to be a part of this community, have us be a part of their choices, has been really so evident, because we were successful. We were successful in reaching a whole community of individuals, and will continue to do so as long as it's open and it's here, who say, I have never been in the museum before. That was the most incredible experience that I just had. I didn't understand all of it, but I'm going to be back. And we talk about belonging, and I think that's a bit of the transition towards making sure that we are getting to our visitors seeing themselves as belonging here.
And we should share that we're pretty much sold out for the next 30 days or 45 days, or something like that. And the feeling in the space is of real engagement and reciprocity and conversation. It's pretty exciting for all of us, I think. So thank you, Makeeba, for your leadership on that. So
I should also just say, I'm sorry, can I say one other thing, which is the two curators taught me so much, right? Like just in the opportunity for me to be in their space while they are talking about the objects that they've chosen, their checklist and the whys and who these artists were and what brought them together. I felt like I was getting one of the most invaluable experiences, and that's true almost every day here. But for me, their generosity was just incredible.
That's wonderful to hear. Okay, Rosa, in the category of unfair question.
Oh gosh.
I know. Okay, so something that you've experienced that you think is going to be really hard to fix at the MFA, and why you think it's important to fix it. So two parts. What seems to you like, oh my God, I don't know how I'm going to fix this. how is it going to ever change? But my God, I'm going to stay in it because it's really important that we change this.
I think, you know, I'm gonna take an easy out on this one, where I'm gonna say the entire, you know, IDA, diversity, equity, accessibility, inclusion, all of this is really hard work. And it will take a lot to fix, but I will stay in it to fix it. And I think there's lots of progress, you know, in talking about, you know, Rob Gibbs and Rob Stahl, and you know, the multilingual project in front of Art of the Americas wing, and Basquiat, and you know, all of these really wonderful things that I've already started before I even got here, are building that momentum, are building trust with communities, are you know, building trust with our staff, affinity groups. You know, all of these things are sort of solutions and things that we put in place so that we can sort of create that vision, that perfect vision that we have, that of fixing it, right? And so I think it'll be difficult, and I think we have a long way to go. But I like the direction that we're moving. And yeah, I think it'll be hard, but I'm going to stay in it. And I know that you'll stay in it, and I know Makeeba's going to stay in it. And so we're going to do this together.
And Makeeba, would you have the same answer if I asked you what seems almost impossible and why is it important to you to get it right?
No, I probably would say I worry so much about the balance between the urgency of becoming an institution that is wholly inclusive in whatever way you want to define that, and the learning curve, right? Like, organizations have learning curves. The people in them have learning curves. I have a learning curve. And that is a real journey. Like, you cannot rush that. And so knowing like how much gas to put on, and when to let up and sort of coast a little bit. And it worries me a great deal because I know that we need to get to a place where the organization starts to do the work unto itself. And when I say the organization, I mean not the Rosas, not the Makeebas, not the strategic plans, but you know, the folks who are leading each of their different divisions, start to probe and interrogate things, just because that becomes the way that we do our work naturally. And I do think that there's urgency. I don't think we have 150 years, which is how long we've invested in becoming the institution we are today, which is not all bad. Certainly, there are many incredibly positive, important, meaningful things about this institution, and that's true, because if not, it would not be worth doing this tough work.
I have a couple of questions that I want to throw in based upon some of the comments you've made, and I remind all of our viewers that we will answer questions from you. We just ask that you type those questions into the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. So please use the Q&A box and send us your questions. I have something that it has always troubled me about museums and other cultural institutions. You've all said it's hard work and it's going to take some time to really field some of the effects of the diversity and inclusion efforts you're making. Why is it so hard? What makes it so difficult for large cultural institutions to, in fact, be welcoming to a more diverse group of individuals?
I'm going to let Matthew answer that, but I'm going to offer that I don't think it's just large cultural institutions. I don't think that we are on an island of our own. And the only other thing I do want to offer is that I think that it's really about who it was built for. Who, you know, who was Harvard built for? Who was the MFA built for? Who, you know, who decided what values created the bricks and mortar and the content inside? I think that's important.
Maybe you can elaborate on that, because it's also my understanding that our large cultural institutions, when they first came into being, very often were developed by people involved with retail, and that many of the large cultural institutions around the country were constructed as a way of bringing in workers so that they could get a sense of what the kinds of things were that they might want to aspire to surround themselves with. But clearly that changed over time. So how is it that museums came to be associated with primarily suburban, affluent, white families, and not so much with the communities that often surrounded them?
Well, you know, I think that it goes back to a number of things we've already spoken of. The notion of the invitation, which is a complicated word in a way, right? Because you have to invite, somebody has to invite. Somebody doesn't just therefore walk in. But I think getting invitation right is still a very important thing. I think it has to do with how the story is told and whether the invited guest feels more than a guest. And I think, to something Makeeba raised, it goes to the question of, well, how are those stories told and by whom? And therefore, what constitutes the notion of knowledge or expertise? And I think that museums were set up with knowledge to be given, not knowledge to be co-created. So knowledge to be given is a form of, I'm going to say it, a certain kind of charity. And so in our original charter, there was a desire to create an educated class who valued art and the role that art could play in civilizing communities. These were the sorts of words that are used in the way the MFA was set up. And at its core, it comes from a very good place, which is to say, share, create a sense of connection, not necessarily belonging, but connection, and do so by giving the ability to learn and understand. But the terms, exactly what Makeeba said, the terms were very much set by those who founded the institution and decided what a Western, non-Western civilization should be defined as. And make no mistake about it, when we were formed in 1870, moved to our current location in the early 1900s, part of the agenda was to put a certain notion of a growing industrial America in the center of an international story. So many of our collections were formed to position American society at the center of an international order. So it was very much about creating a place for an assumed knowledge, an assumed sense of civility and community that then would be shared outwardly. And I think that what you're hearing, what excites me about listening to Rosa and Makeeba, is that what we're trying to do is to create something together in a different way. And when you can start to do that, you can create a different notion of invitation and welcome. If you're not just presenting, if you're not just giving, but giving from something that you own. And I think that's shifting. And by the way, I think that that's important for all museums. That's my conviction. My conviction is that the most important thing that museums create is audience. And when I say that, I sometimes get pushback because, well, the most important thing we create is our collection. The most important thing we create is research. The most important thing we create is, but it isn't actually, in my view. I mean, you can't get to create audience without it being rooted in something, and the museum is, I'm going to say it, And Makeeba knows I'm not competitive, but you know, the MFA is one of the great museums of the world by virtue of what it holds. But how we share it and how we engage with it and how we create knowledge together around it is our test. But in the end, we create audience, because if we do that right, we create that sense of belonging. And when you create a sense of belonging, you create an institution that is connected deeply to its community. And the answer, Ted, to your question is, that wasn't the goal. The goal wasn't to make the museum feel as though it was part of the community. It was to serve the community. And there's a big difference in my judgment.
The MFA, unlike many other large American museums, does not receive any kind of substantial funding from the city or the state, except for grants. How does that distinguish what it is that the museum then does as an institution that is so often perceived to be a public institution, as opposed to an institution that's dependent on membership, attendance, and private philanthropy?
Well, I do think that we have had a great run in the context of service. And it's one of the reasons why for so many years we've had a very important, highly functioning education department. Great public programs, because we were serving. And therefore we were able to create a financial model that earned revenue and achieved a high level of philanthropy through truly generous leaders in this community who believed in that notion of service. By the way, we have to sustain that, but we have to broaden it to also co-create content so that more people can feel committed to the institution. But the fact that we don't receive government funding, which in fact is a bit of an understatement, since there are political bodies who actually want us to pay them money, does put pressure on us to be attuned to how our audiences receive what we do. And it's very important to us to make sure that we create urgent and meaningful programming. Our gambit, what Makeeba and Rosa and others leading the institution are doing at this moment, is that we will do better if we change some of the content, if we change the way in which people are heard within the institution, that more people will support us and there'll be more energy coming to the institution. And I do think we are at a bit of an inflection point in that regard. I do think that. I do think that questioning of authority that I spoke of at the beginning is part of a shift that means we have to engage people differently.
How do you see the museum bringing together through programming and other activities, the traditional museum going public with the groups that you believe should now feel more welcome, more of a sense of belonging within the museum? How do you structure and shape programming that brings those groups together in a way wherein they develop more of an understanding of each other?
That is a great interview question. Let's pretend that Rosa and Makeeba are applying for a job. How would you answer that question? How do you do, you know, and Makeeba, it is actually something we're talking about. How do you find the blend?
I have a good response to that, which is why do we start with the premise that different communities need different programming? I have had this conversation with Matthew where I have argued that I would love to, have we not been interrupted? I think that being able to find a way to entice people who choose Basquiat first to walk across the museum and go into Monet and vice versa is highly, highly possible. It takes some work. It means you have to figure out what the connection points are and sort of the reason why there is a story in there, right, for anybody. But I don't think that, you know, as a person of color, I need to have a different type of program designed for me. I think generationally, perhaps, you know, I think age might be a little bit different, but not necessarily even, I think that's not even true, because I think that if you get it right, if you have authentic, connected, and relevant, relevant content, I would argue anybody can find an intersection in.
One of the questions that's come in is around whether there are ways of drawing in a community through art making as well as through art viewing. What are the kinds of activities that
Absolutely
would do that? And again, I remind folks, if you have questions, please type them into the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can. But let's talk about art making within the museum.
Our when we were convening our community celebrations, for example, always had a room for art making for children. And at some point, we realized that there were more adults in line than there were children, and we had to open up a whole nother room because everybody wanted this therapeutic, cathartic opportunity to make. And so, you know, when we closed, I will say that one of the first things that my team did was we figured out how to create kits for art making. And we literally drove around the city and dropped them off at all of our partners because we knew intuitively that we had some kind of responsibility to continue to provide an outlet for our community, literally the community that would typically come in here and make. We took the making to them. And so we missed that terribly, but I think that's very powerful.
Let me ask a question. It's not necessarily a controversial question, but it's about a somewhat controversial subject. The MFA was involved, is involved with a group of museums around the world that have committed to showing the work of an American artist, Philip Guston, who has done work, the portions of which include imagery, which it's my understanding, he says, as much as anything, is of a part of himself, as depicted in Ku Klux Klan racist robes. The exhibition was originally scheduled to open sooner, and then apparently the institutions decided that they needed more time to contextualize that work. Could you talk about what it means when a museum or a cultural institution takes on a potentially controversial subject? Matthew will remember that we worked on the Mapplethorpe photography exhibition a number of years ago. But when you take on a potentially controversial work, what is the nature of the contextualization that you look for? And how do you go about generating productive dialogue out of what it is you are showing?
So, yeah, I'll say something about that since I'm sort of in the center of it, but Makeeba and Rosa, you may want to share your own thoughts from either a staff point of view or from a leader's point of view. You know, what you're referring to, Ted, is a commitment that we made to co-organize a retrospective of the work of Philip Guston, an artist who died in 1980, had a 50-year career as an abstract painter, but also made representational images. And towards the end of his life, it included images of the Ku Klux Klan and other social justice and portrait images. It was an exhibition we were organizing with the National Gallery in Washington. We invited the Tate to become in London to become part of it, and Houston to become part of it. So I'm saying that because 4 different institutions with 4 different local situations. But you know, we started the work on the project 4.5 years ago. It is partly what we're talking about. It's partly what we're talking about, how you create audience. It's partly what we're talking about when we say, how do you create an invitation? Circumstances change. The reception of art changes. And so there was nothing in Guston's work, and by the way, his Klan images he had done as early as 1930. He was a very adamant social justice, racial justice artist who believed deeply in change in our society. Meaning to say, and I'm going to say it clearly, the work came from good intention. And from the point of view of his making, there was authenticity, credibility, and deep thinking. The question for us was not about the acceptability of that work. Acceptability comes from within the work. It is acceptable work. The question came about the act of presentation in the museum. Was this the time for us to do the exhibition as we originally conceived it, with relatively little contextualization? Not none, but relatively little, the belief in the artist? Or was this a time for us to pause and say, you know what? We have to create a different, I'm going to use this word, sense of hospitality. How do we create a hospitable reception for Guston's work? And the argument goes, I took this position and I hold to this position, that we needed to create a more hospitable environment for his work to be understood. What does this mean? It means that we have to change to some degree the way it's presented, but here's the point. We also have to change the way the institution works to create the meaning in the exhibition space. What do I mean by that? I could have said to Makeeba, you know, Makeeba, we've got a problem with this show. Can you write 4 new labels? Makeeba would have done a brilliant job. Trust me, brilliant, okay? It would have argued for how to position this and how to think about it differently. And by the way, if you go into this room, you might see this. That would have been good. But it wouldn't have changed the way the institution thought about this issue, which is that we have a responsibility for creating a context for the images that we show to be understood. Museums do an inconsistent job of that. I'm not saying a bad job, but an inconsistent job of understanding religion, faith, belief, racial difference, cultural conflict. We don't do a great job or a consistent job of talking about those issues. So Makeeba could have written 4 or 5. By the way, she could have written 7 great labels, but it wouldn't have changed the way the institution thinks about its responsibility. And that's one of the things that I wanted to achieve. So we decided to postpone the exhibition. Of course, we lost the narrative. I get it. That's my point about we live in a time of great skepticism, of illegitimacy, right? We were accused of canceling it. We never were going to cancel it. In the end, I'm pleased to say that we are opening the exhibition. We will go first in the sequence of the other institutions, and we are all in. And by the way, Makeeba is going to write a few labels, but it's going to come out of the context of real good conversation, which Rosa is going to help us with, which is how do you create the conversation in the institution to have an outward expression of your values in a consistent way. I gave you a long answer, but it's really important for us to do as well as we can with this project. I don't know, Makeeba and Rosa, if you want to add anything about how you experience the Guston process.
I know Rosa might not have been here quite yet. I would say we've been deep in this conversation. I think the few things that are important that we concluded, I think correctly, was that it wasn't a Guston problem. It was not a Black Lives Matter problem. It wasn't that racism or the Ku Klux Klan or imagery of nooses were all of a sudden triggering for people of color. They have been and they will continue to be. It was about the museums. And it was about our ability collectively to do the work. And I think there had to be an acknowledgement, which I would probably argue has not entirely happened yet, that not that work hadn't been done, to Matthew's point, but that the right work had not happened. It had not happened. And I think we've gotten away with that. We, the museums, many times for decades, for a very long time. because we are given so much power. We are given so much authority to be experts right here. And I think this was one time that we weren't, we weren't going to get away with it without having some accountability. And so I'm incredibly proud that we're going to be going first. And I'm really proud that we're going to have an opportunity to share some of that authority.
The demographics of our region have changed quite dramatically over the last decade and a half. You can't hold a community meeting without bringing multiple translators into the meeting. What do you envision the museum doing moving forward to reach out to all of these many more diverse constituencies than Boston and the New England region have ever experienced?
I am as anxious as you are, Ted, to hear Rosa's answer.
I knew you were going to say that. Well, I'm going to say that, the work that has started to happen at the Art of the Americas wing with the multilingual welcome is certainly a step towards that. But I will also, kind of push back a little, not push back, but, I know we have to be intentional about what we do, and we will think about those things. But I think, the museum is an international space. We have folks from all over the world that come here, on a regular basis. And so as we think about what those solutions and facilitating those solutions and those strategies and initiatives may be, I think a lot of that work is there because it is a space that welcomes people from all over the world. But I am, really encouraged by the work that Leila and Ethan and their team have started over at the Art of the Americas wing with that beautiful wall, with the new art work that's up, and the languages that are there is really exciting, and it's really powerful when you hear people talk about it and say, "Oh, I've never seen my language up there."
So two things to say about that. One is what Rosa's referring to is when you walk into the Art of the Americas now, for those of you on the call who haven't been recently, we used to have this large Copley portrait of George IV, and it has come down. And in its place are two remarkable works by T.C. Cannon, died young Native American artist. And around the paintings are a welcome statement in, I don't know, is it like 23, 25 languages, which communicates something very different than George IV on his horse. But two things. Number one, we wouldn't have taken down the Copley painting if it was our only Copley, right? We have 20 Copleys, by the way, many of them portraits of slaveholders, in our galleries. Okay, so this is my point about how do you acknowledge the past while moving to the present. So we're not going to be a no Copley museum. We may do some things as we start to do to contextualize some of the sitters and Copley's paintings. For example, we have a blank frame in that gallery, and we ask the question, whose portrait wasn't done when Copley was painting at that time in America? And we listed 5 or 6 extraordinary Bostonians whose portraits could have been done, but were never done. So, we're prepared to engage with Copley in that way, and Copley's an honored part of our past. So that's one thing to note, is that how do you engage with something that is forward-looking while still representing the past? But the second point to make is that introductory wall will become part of a project that will go all the way through the Art of the American wings eventually, which is a translation project. And the translation project is not, so I'll say it very simply in the following way. It's not just about taking some words and putting them in another language, but we are doing that. We are doing that, and there'll be a number of languages unspoken before in the museum that are on those labels. And they will be in relation to the indigenous culture of the artist. But we're also going to write the labels in the language and the expression of leaders from those cultures. So there is a different way about talking about art in this culture than that culture. So it isn't just a matter of using the same words that we define, but putting them in a different language. It's about engaging in partnership, finding a way to express that meaning, for example, of art in a language that is indigenous to the maker, which is not just the words, but the tone, the construction of the sentence, all the rest. And our hope, I think I'm right, Makeeba, our hope is that this will be a template for something we can do throughout the museum. And if we do that, believe me, that is an extraordinary statement about invitation and welcome. It changes the idea of invitation. And by the way, it's certainly a different word for meaning of reciprocity, because we've reached out to at least 15 different staff members who speak a range of native languages and come from various cultural backgrounds, and they're going to help us in this project.
You know, over time, I've learned that when one takes a look at any institution, it could be a museum or higher education or the real estate industry or law or high tech or finance. At the moment you look at any of the industries and cultures through the perspective of diversity, inevitably you find yourself asking questions as to who's been using those institutions and how and why. What have they gotten from them? And that's certainly the case in terms of cultural institutions. So as you're making the changes that you're making at this moment, what would you envision the museum's culture would be, and how people might use that, let's say 10 years from now? Not so much what would the programming changes be, but what would the culture of the museum itself be, and why would people want to go there?
You know, I'll say something. Rosa, Makeeba, do you want to go first? So Ted, we had a board member at the ICA. You were a board member, I was a staff member, and I once said to her, you know, what do you want from the museum, from the ICA, I just want it to be interesting. Don't bore us, right? Which was sort of, you know, it was sort of a funny thing, because I thought, really? And then, I mean, I've never forgotten it, you know? So what I think is, if you want your museum not to be boring, and if you want your museum to be interesting, you have to accept that you have a high standard of care for those objects. You need to preserve them. You need to invest in all those things around the care. But you have to accept that the meaning of those objects is not fixed. You have to accept that the energy in your museum comes from different points of view, conversation, convening, conflict, contestation. That's what brings it alive. It brings the past alive. You know, we've changed some labels on some of our paintings in the American wing. And, you know, I said to one of our colleagues, you know, are we trying to change and censor history? And the response was, no, we're actually trying to bring history into the present. We're trying to give these works of art new life. We're trying to make them come alive. And that's what I would say, is that if you were to ask us about the museum in 5 or 10 years, we would like to say we kept our collections safe, we cared for it at the highest level, and we brought it alive because we opened up our understanding of what those objects were. That would be the culture that I would hope that we could create. And that is not an always moving kaleidoscope, but it's an active space where ideas are moving.
So this course this semester is focused on recovery strategies and what might happen post-COVID. What can we expect and what would you hope to be able to share over the next 2 to 3 years, given all of the economic and accessibility issues that that COVID has raised for us? What's in the immediate future?
Well, Makeeba and Rosa might want to say something very specific about some things they're working on. I would just say we have a strategic plan. It's about a certain kind of openness. It's about a certain trajectory to a different kind of invitation, welcome, forms of engagement. And I think you're going to see us be more evidently engaged in that with learners of all ages, whether it's a paid internship program, whether it's more interactive interpretation, whether it's more of a commitment to studio learning. There's going to be more back and forth. There's going to be more sense of activity that connects people to the space.
I would agree with that, and I would say, Ted, that we have not paused. The pandemic has been hugely overwhelming, but even when our doors were closed, we were continuing to show up, and in many ways more important than ever before. So I think that one of the things we've learned is how much of a contribution we can make to the city, and how much of a responsibility we have to the city and to the people in this city. And I would love to know that we'll continue to move forward, really owning that and saying, how do we make sure that we have firsts? We have banners on the front of the building right now that were created by the first artist who's local. Rob Stull is from Boston. The first time in 150 years, and he's a Black man. That means that the next time it happens, it won't be the first time. We, decided that we were going to start doing programming in our empty museum, and we had concerts going, and we made a commitment to always have captioning for any program that was virtual or digital. And we went so far as to actually have live signing embedded in our musical concerts. It was the first time we had done that. We were forced to think about that as a mechanism because we wanted to make sure we were communicating with everybody as possible. The next time we do that, it will no longer be the first time. So I think we will do more of that. We will be less fearful of trying something the first time.
So that is a reminder that the museum is open. It continues to be a vital citizen within our community. It is going through transformations brought on by leadership, brought on by changes in our community, brought on by a clear sense that museums can no longer be what they once were, as places perceived to be fusty and only serving the needs and desires of a fairly limited population. I want to thank Rosa and Makeeba and Matthew for the work that they're doing. I want to thank them for their openness this evening. I want to thank our audience for joining with us over the course of this transformative semester. We will be back in late January with the spring semester's open classroom focused on placemaking, economic development, social justice. And back in the fall, addressing other issues of race and anti-Semitism, and again, social justice. So I hope that everyone will have a very happy and primarily a very safe holiday season. Wear those masks, do your social distancing, and be careful throughout the holiday period. And my thanks to our guests tonight for sharing with us a sense of what the future of a major cultural institution, not just in Boston or America, but throughout the world, has been and will continue to be. With that, good night.